I would like to emphasize and underline once again that this event is co-organized by the Institute for Human Sciences that Shalini Randeria is the rector of, together with Visual Culture Research Center in Kyiv. And Shalini Randeria is also a research director and professor of social anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. And her lecture is called Decentering Europe, which I think yesterday we discussed a bit. Is it a legal, so to say, term to use today, especially in the Ukrainian circumstances, or not? So first of all, here at the beginning, I wanted to say that actually it totally overlaps with the intention of the School of Abducted Europe itself, because it's based on the idea to oppose the neo-colonial approach of European metropolis to European peripheries. So we are trying somehow to rethink the potentiality of the bigger Europe, of the broader Europe. That's why I think decentering is also very important. And for me, yesterday when I was thinking about this topic and discussing with Shalini, I remembered first of all the metaphor, which is the best example how politics becomes poetry, which is a famous quotation from Marx, what was solid melt into the ear. So that is actually, I think, absolutely fits to the decentering idea and somehow depicts our reality, which really what we had as territory, right? Terra, soil, ground, now is treated in terms of fluidity, flows, in terms of migration and refugees and so on. So that's why I also think that if we take into account not only the European East but also the European South, and both regions are experiencing the conditions of the warfare and what is usually in the media consensus called the refugee crisis in Europe is actually there is no refugee crisis. These are people who are escaping the warfare, which we have the war in the East and war in the South of Europe. And that is like totally different circumstances that appear today. And another thing from the philosophical tradition to refer to about decentering Europe, I also remember that actually Aristotle was the first one who was trying to decenter Europe, because he was treating Greece being outside Europe, and for him Europe was like obscure western lands somewhere outside the horizon. So it's always about chercher la femme, about some missing element which you have to find somehow. So probably, yeah, decentering is also a key idea for the situation with the displaced and refugees, because maybe Europe is the refugee itself. I also remembered a famous manifesto written by Hannah Arendt, We Refugees, which also somehow depicts this situation. So it will be always like an object somewhere, and even if you refer to the Greek myth, Europe being abducted and raped by Zeus, she disappeared, and her three brothers got out from their houses and started to search for her. And by the way, none of them has found her, so it's always missing. So that's why I think decentralizing is another like sort of the way to reclaim Europe, which is still missing also here. Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and a very, very kind introduction. I don't know if I'm going to do what you propose I should be doing. But as long as I can entertain you for 15 minutes, I think we are good. And then I'd be very happy to have a discussion with you, because really for me, it's more about having a discussion. In fact, I signaled to Tatiana that maybe we should just forget about the talk. The discussion before me was going very well, and we should have just continued with that, and I would have been very happy listener. But since I've been made to move here, let me try to be very brief and make a couple of arguments which I don't know if they will make sense to you, because I think it's so much a question of where one is looking at this entire question of decentering Europe from. So probably I think this might be one of the least popular lectures I ever gave. And I think in a way to want to make an argument for decentering Europe in a country where both popular sentiment and, as I'm beginning to realize, even academic discourse is highly and unalloyedly, in a sense, pro-Europe is a daunting task. I think it may even be a foolhardy task in the city of the Euromaidan, where people risk their lives to not only want to belong to Europe, to claim themselves as Europeans, and to make a very, very strong argument that they should be treated as full and equal members of Europe, so that in a sense making the argument to decenter Europe here may even be a foolhardy task. Let me try and say why for me this is important, and I think, as Vasil said, the context of the refugee crisis gives it a political edge as well, my argument. One reason I make it is an academic one, and that is as somebody who is a sociologist and an anthropologist by profession. What bothers me is the Eurocentrism of almost all social science theorizing, and I really think it's important to broaden the basis of both historical writing and social science theories, and one major problem which stands in the way of understanding the specificity of non-European societies, and after all, 3/4 of the world's population lives outside of Europe. So that is the majority of the world. In trying to understand the past experiences, the present experiences of this part of the world, what comes in the way is a certain framework of Eurocentric thinking in which Europe does something very contradictory. It sets itself up both as something which is unique and something which is generalizable. So Europe is unique because it has a developmental trajectory of secularism, of democracy, of capitalism, of human rights, which is totally European and uniquely so. On the other hand, it also claims that this is a trajectory which is generalizable. And I think here at the heart of these contradictions lie a lot of the political problems which we face. But the second problem is the one which Vasil mentioned, the refugee problem. I think a more inclusive Europe is only possible if we are able to think of Europe without the kind of Eurocentrism which underpins a lot of thinking about Europe. So I think for me, decentering Europe is both an intellectual but also a political project. Now, I stand here neither to praise nor to bury Europe. My major argument really is going to be to think of Europe in terms not sui generis, as Europe tends to think of it, self-in, as an enclosed, bounded entity in which there are endless debates about whether Turkey belongs to Europe. No, it couldn't because it's not Christian. Does Russia belong to Europe? No, it couldn't, but then obviously Christianity won't work. So you need another criteria by which you can now need to exclude Russia from the history of Europe. But then Eastern Europe, is it really Europe? Yes, but a backward Europe. And these are the terms of the debate, I think, which a lot of people also take on themselves. And you can take on the terms of the debate in considering yourself backward, as not yet as far advanced and as modern as Western Europe, or you can turn around the debate as a lot of Islamic and Hindu fundamentalists do. So they take the binary opposition between Europe and the rest of the world, but they valorize it differently. So they say, as in the freedom struggle in India often was heard under British rule, so if Europe is materialistic, we are spiritual, and therefore we are superior. So you can turn around the same binary opposition which you are given as an essence of your society as different from something European, and you can turn it around and say, but therefore this is superior. And in a way, this kind of civilizational discourse is something which we are hearing from Putin. We are back in this world of a 19th century civilizational discourse, which if you come from India, you know very well. This is about Western civilization as being absolutely superior to civilization anywhere else. And I remind you of the achievements that the West is so proud of equality, human rights, democracy, egalitarianism. If you were to ask my grandmother and my mother, they will tell you that they have only learnt about all of these values in negation. Colonialism was racism, hierarchy, asymmetry, non-equality, non-recognition, and the denial of any rights of citizenship. So that at the same time that Europe was proclaiming all of these ideas and ideals and values about itself, this was precisely the time when it was negating them in practice in the colonies. So if you were to ask the generation of my parents and grandparents, they would tell you a very different history of European modernity, one in which they would say, these are the values of democracy, equality, human rights, which they struggled for against the British. It's not something which the British or any European gave them. And it is in this kind of a context that when Mahatma Gandhi was asked by a young British journalist in the 1920s, he said, Mr. Gandhi, what do you think of European civilization? And Gandhi said, it would be a very good idea. So that if you are thinking of Europe from the outside, but this outside, as most of you know, is a very varied outside, because if you think in terms of this binary between the West and the rest, then Japan is a member of the Honorary Western Club, right? But since when is Japan a member of the Honorary Western Club? This boundary is, as Edward Said reminds us, this is an imaginative geography. This is not a real geography. And so that the imaginative geography of Europe, of Westernity, of the West, of Western modernity is very stretchable. And it depends on the political imaginations of the day, on the ideological positions you want to support with it, the kind of argument that one is willing to make. Now, the reason why this binary worries me about, and I think Edward Said's work on Orientalism is fundamental to this kind of argument, this binary of Europe as against the others, this worries me is because this binary gets used in other parts. So Europe excludes with this binary, right? So you are hearing all these discourses about we can take the refugees, but we will not take in Muslims, so we will take in only Christian refugees. We are hearing even prime ministers, elected prime ministers of countries in Eastern Europe saying second generation Muslims cannot be integrated because terrorism is something which is genetically passed on in these second generations. So this irreconcilable difference of the others, of the non-European, is something which has a long genealogy. But what also happens is that this entire European discourse of difference has got globalized as well. So you are getting on the side of the Hindu and the Muslim fundamentalists both a search for totally spurious authenticity of their own civilizations, with all kinds of arguments, like the Indian Prime Minister made last year, saying that the Indians had cloning and plastic surgery in the 5th century, before Europe even knew modern surgery. And then he had all kinds of mythological figures which he brought in, the Indian god with an elephant trunk, this would only come about if you could do plastic surgery, etc. Right? But so, this is about making claims for your own superiority using the kinds of ideas and the tools in order to validate yourself in European eyes. And there is this catching up modernity, but this catching up modernity can turn totally perverse, in which you begin to claim you were already there, right? And so you will get claims about Islamic democracy as being the Uru democracy, much before Europe ever had democracy, etc. This, of course, as you would say in German in one sentence, it is just mixing up Genese and Geltung. So the fact that something originates somewhere has nothing to do with whether its validity is tied to that origin, even if it originates there. And I think this is it's a huge problem. So I think the European insistence that human rights are of Western origin, whether this is true or not, I will leave aside, because I think one can write a different genealogy of human rights. One can write an intercultural genealogy of human rights, interreligious genealogy. One can even write a different political history of human rights as the Universal Declaration, in which non-Western nations took a large part. Interestingly, Gandhi received one day a message saying, "Mr. Gandhi, will you comment on human rights?" And he wrote back a very famous postcard saying, "My grandmother always taught me that if I do my duty, my rights will take care of themselves." And this was a strange reply, but it's an interesting reply, turning around the question of, rather than claiming rights, what if everybody were to think seriously about their obligations? But I leave that aside. The insistence that human rights are a Western product in order to claim this originary status for them, I think, regardless of the intellectual merits of the position, politically makes it very easy for the Chinese rulers to say, so they don't apply to us. And I think by turning these things into authentic European achievements, one is making it extraordinarily difficult for those people who are fighting for human rights in other parts of the world, as much for gender rights in other parts of the world. One is making it very, very difficult for them to claim these for themselves, because they can always be accused very quickly in this highly politicized environment that they are importing values which are Western, which do not belong. So it is as if we attach certain values to places, and then we will have to find exactly where in Europe this originated. And in order to do that, one will have to erase also many parts of European history, because in this kind of story of European secularism, democracy, human rights, it's a story of infinite European progress. And then you will have to erase the entire history of totalitarianism, you will have to erase the history of fascism, etc. But not only that, it erases what I call the relationality. And the relationality is important for me for the following reason. When Europe is secularizing itself in the 19th century, this is the time when it is missionizing in every colony. So it's not as if European secularity or secularism is something which is generalized. Europe turns secular but missionizes in the colonies. Europe starts to develop for itself, and I mean Western Europe. This is, when I'm thinking in these terms, I'm thinking very specifically of British developments, but it doesn't look very different for France or for Netherlands either. It's the time when in Britain, for example, individual citizenship rights are being institutionalized. This is exactly the time in British colonies the British are institutionalizing racist hierarchies of caste or tribes. So it's a Janus-faced modernity that we are faced with here. And because in the previous discussion we've heard a little bit about Foucault, it's interesting that this is a blind spot for Foucault. Foucault is able to write about the development of the modern European subject and the modern European state, but certainly the modern European subject, without thinking about racism as at the root of the development of a certain kind of modern European subject. And I think, I mean, here I think Hannah Arendt, whom Marcy has mentioned several times, has a really, really key insight when she says that fascism can only be understood as German desire for colonies turning inward. So there is a relationship between the world outside Europe and developments in Europe, which the way in which Europe looks at itself, tells its own history, it sequesters and separates. So, for example, in most British universities, you will have something called British history, and then you will have something called Commonwealth history. And these two are totally separate because the history of the Commonwealth takes place in the Commonwealth and British history takes place on the British Islands, as if the two were not joined by centuries of imperial rule. And this is, if you remember Salman Rushdie's novel, Midnight's Children, you have this character, Visky Sisodia, who says, the problem with the British is they know so little about their own history because most of it happened overseas. And it's that disconnect between the larger global history, which is as much part of British history as what happened on the British island, as it is what happened in the colonies. It's this disconnect which allows a certain story to be told about Europe, to Europe, and to the rest of the world. So I think it's this co-production that I'm interested in, how European modernity is predicated and Western European modernity, because in my case, what I'm thinking of is colonial and imperial modernity. It's predicated not only on the economic exploitation of the colonies, so it would have been impossible to industrialize Britain without the raw materials from the colonies, but it would have also not been possible to have modern techniques of governance. Now, this is something which Foucault is thinking about when he's thinking about how the modern state in Europe develops. What he does not see is, for example, fingerprinting. When we think of identification and identities, the modern state depends very much on being able to identify each of its citizens. It means fingerprinting as a technology. It is developed in India. The modern state needs mapping of territory, cadastral mapping. This was impossible to do in France. It's in the French colonies that cadastral mapping first gets done and gets transferred then to France as a technology of mapping in order to tax. So these very simple tools of modern governance are all developed in the colonies and transferred back to Europe, such that there is no way of telling the history of Europe as something which happened only here and not there. And for me, the question then is, how do we think of this modernity, which someone like Eisenstadt thinks in terms of multiple modernities. So he says there is Japanese modernity and Islamic modernity. The Western modernity he turns into two, because he says the American modernity takes a very different form from European modernity. because religion has a different role in both of these complexes. The problem with Eisenstadt's idea of multiple modernities, for me, there are two problems. One, that it's still very Weberian in that it's civilizational. It's thinking in terms of the units whose paths and patterns of modernity he's describing are civilizational units, and civilizations are religiously grounded for him. And this, for me, if you come from India, this presents a problem, because anything which you will describe as an Indian civilization must be both Hindu and Islamic. So to read Indian modernity as Hindu modernity is a political project of the Hindu fundamentalists. This is not a sociological analysis that one should be doing. We just would erase out many, many centuries of Islam to think of Indian modernity as Hindu modernity. So I have a problem with these multiplicities, but my second problem with these multiple modernities is, apart from the unit of analysis, the problem as if each of these develops independently of one another. And in contradistinction to that, I have been arguing for a long time to think in terms of entangled modernities. Entangled histories of modernity, which allow us to talk about the many centuries of interaction between, whether we want to think of in terms of nation states, civilizations, regions, and then we really have to figure out what are the units whose modernity we want to think about. But I think, and let me end on the last 2 points, the two methodological points I want to make is, so today I was looking at some of the photographs that I was shown, was in part of a project on local modernities. And I think the pluralization of modernity is interesting, but the question is, what is the adjective that we attach to it? So there are people who are talking in terms of local modernities, those who are talking in terms of vernacular modernities, those who talk in terms of multiple modernities. The problem with all of these conceptualizations for me is that local has always, or vernacular, there is always a normativity in which it's inferior to something which is either global or something which is central, something which is more above. Vernacular compared to what it is a vernacular to. And therefore, all of these conceptualizations still leave Europe in the center. They leave Europe at the center of a modernity which either gets copied or less well or not well. So it's still conceptualizing history in these Eurocentric terms means that you are thinking constantly in terms of the history of non-Europe as a history of lags, temporal lags and lags. And so it's about temporal lags, so it's about catching up, and it's about lags, it's about absences. So non-Europe is always something which Europe is not. And this negative understanding of oneself does not allow thinking in terms of specificities which are not in relation to an absence of something. So then I started thinking about how else could we think about these relationalities, which would also allow us to get away from this idea, as Deepesh Chakravarti calls it, the rest of the world as the permanent understudy in history where only Europe is on the stage. And so you're always learning this part, but you're never going to be good enough to play this part. So you are a permanent understudy in this history. And the other kind of image which I often have when I'm reading European accounts of how the world transforms itself is a kind of a billiard ball model. So the agency is on the part of Europe playing billiard balls, and then it has a ball which hits something in the colony, and the only thing which can happen outside Europe is as a result of an impulse which came from Europe. So there is no agency on the other side. Now, of course, the problem with some of post-colonial theory, and this is an interesting problem, Often when I talk in a post-colonial perspective, European historians will say to me, you are giving too much importance to colonialism. Why do you want to reduce all of Indian history to the history of 200 years of colonialism? So the post-colonial is accused of over-magnifying the importance of colonialism. And there could be many answers to this, but my very simple answer to this often is to say, after 200 years of colonial rule, there is no way to look at an Indian past, the pre-colonial past, which is not looked at through the lens of colonialism. It changed the terms of the debate, it changed the vocabulary, it changed the optic, and it changed self-representations. So even very fundamental terms in the history and society of India, for example, the term caste, which all of us, in terms of what does India have, it has many castes. Caste is a Portuguese word, casta. It's about Rebsorten, casta, and you think of it in terms of differences. The word Hinduism, Hindu, did not connote a religion at all. Hinduism, the term Hindu comes from the river Indus, which is in today's Pakistan, and basically anybody who was a Hindu who lived on the other side of the river Indus. So it was a geographical description and had nothing to do with the religion. But through the British census in terms of castes and through the British insistence on seeing India in terms of Hindus and Muslims, both of these became categories of self-definition. There is no way to think them out of people's self-identities now, because that is exactly how people would define themselves today, in terms which they have learned in the last 200 years, but terms which take a meaning of their own, and they have a history now, and people's identifications are very much in terms of these very modern identities, which allow one to think in terms of how many members of my caste are there, how many Hindus are there. So these highly enumerated identities, as against the very fluid identities which you had earlier, once they come into existence, you can't wish them out of existence. And therefore, there is just no way that you can go back to any kind of a vocabulary for understanding Indian society which would allow you a pre-colonial take on it. And therefore, there is no way to think it away. The question is, how critically are we able to deal with it in terms of this kind of a relational look, where not only is Indian society or Egyptian society a product, or Indonesian society a product of British or Dutch imperial rule, but Britain and Netherlands themselves are products of that relationship as well. And so my point would be to see Europe itself as a product of this relationship, and if that's the case, I think we need to think about then inclusion and exclusion in very, very different terms. Just as Western modernity is part of an Indian or an Indonesian or a Brazilian modernity, so it's not something outside of it. Similarly, imperial and colonial categories, colonial rule, colonial techniques of governance, identities, etc., are part of European modernity and not something outside of it. And I think this changes the terms in which one has to think in terms of migration, refugees, inside and outside of Europe.
Thank you very much. So in case you have questions, please raise your hand and introduce yourself. You are more than welcome to share with your comments, ideas, questions. Please. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Alexa Alexandra, I'm a strategist. The question I have is, colonialism is probably not the most favorite topic in Britain, just like it's not in France and the other former colonies. Nevertheless, it is present in the discourse. With our northern neighbor, it is not anywhere near the discourse. Maybe 200 years is a bit more than 70 years, but actually the country we're in now is living its post-colonial history without fully recognizing it has been a colony. Maybe you have some reflections on this, and maybe we can connect it somehow to the modern history of Ukraine.
Thank you. I mean, I think the connections are something you will have to make for me, and how to think about colonialism in this particular context. You are absolutely right. The lack of reflection on colonialism is something, I think, which is characteristic of all colonizing societies. France is probably the worst in this respect, in the non-recognition.
I could draw a couple of Belgians or Dutch.
Okay, Belgium. Okay, so I don't follow the Belgian debates. In Germany, interestingly, I remember giving the first talks about post-colonial theories, post-colonial perspectives, like 22 years ago, and the first reaction was to say, Germany just had such few colonies, and the ones that had it lost so early, so actually it didn't have any effect on German history at all. Very slowly, however, this debate began to take form, and interestingly, so I think the first time, this was 1998 when I gave my first lecture, 1999. And within 7 or 8 years, 2002, when Sebastian Conrad and I published our first book, Jenseits von Eurocentrism, Centrismus, Campus Verlag, our publisher, said, look, it's a good book, I'm doing it for you, but this book isn't going to sell at all. So actually, don't take this personally, but we're not going to give you many royalties for this. And we said, okay, so he should do the book. It's very, very important he should do the book. Within 10 years, the book's gone into a second edition, an expanded edition, and today the debate looks very, very different. Because a lot of people then started looking at German history in terms of exactly this paradigm switch that we have managed to bring about. Then, interestingly, when I went to Switzerland 15 years ago, the idea was that Switzerland never had any colonies, so obviously this doesn't apply to us. And then we started discussing with Swiss historians, and they started finding very, very interesting material. They found advertisements, they found all kinds of things about children's books, consumer culture in Switzerland, etc., which could be analyzed using this kind of an optic of relational thinking on entanglements. But what they also found, and this has been the large project of 3 books that we've done together on this, is that to find you don't have to have colonies to benefit from colonies. You can benefit as the neutral third in colonial conflicts abroad. You can benefit from putting a lot of money into the transatlantic slave trade without having the slaves in your country. So one can have very complex kinds of involvements in the colonial enterprise without the country possessing territory. Now, most of these empires that we are talking about are overseas empires. They are not contiguous territories, like in your case. And I think one of the things which may merit some thinking about is what difference does it make in the kinds of sensibilities, in the kinds of techniques of rule, etc. If these are overseas empires, does the duration matter? Do linguistic differences, racial stereotypes, what kinds of roles do they play, depending on when the empire is, when it is dismantled, through what kinds of political movements, etc. Does the larger global context make a difference to the consciousness and sensibilities on both sides, etc. So I think one would ask a lot of questions, including questions as to why there is so little consciousness in Russia of itself as an imperial power, or is there a consciousness of itself as one which has lost a lot of its empire, and that is the driving force for a lot of the geopolitics which we are seeing now. So I think one could ask some very interesting questions also in terms of school textbooks. We were analyzing British school textbooks and finding where does colonialism become a subject at all? So in France this is still a very, very fraught topic. You cannot deal with French colonialism in French textbooks, in schools, right? So it makes a lot of difference, the history which is taught to children, what is the official history, what is it that you socialize generations of your citizens into believing about the history of your country. And so I think those are the kinds of questions one could start thinking about. And I mean, what I was interested in once when I was in Poland, I was asking them about this German-Polish school textbook program which they have, where they started writing these school textbooks together to try and see if they could come to a kind of a common understanding of this history, because you know these entanglements are very asymmetrical entanglements, of course, with a lot of power relationships involved in them. And so the fact that there are these very different kinds of entanglements doesn't mean that they are seen on both sides in a similar fashion. So it would be interesting to try and understand if one could arrive at some kind of consensus about how a particular narrative might work on both sides or not. But in the present situation, I think it's just too fraught politically to try and get there at all.
Yes, there's another question here.
Yeah, my name is Anton Shekhovsov, and thank you, Shalini, for your presentation. My question is not really a question, but rather a comment or a remark. By these multiple references to colonialism, you seem to still speaking of Europe from the very West European perspective.
Yes.
And there were some moments when I thought you were generalizing too much. For example, you were talking about the secularization process in Europe, and then you say that they were still missionizing in India, say, or in overseas colonies. But those are very different people who did that. Those were the church people. You know, church sent the missionaries to the overseas territories, but the churches did not do the secularization process in Europe. So there were the two different drivers, and were responsible for these obviously conflicting processes. But you know, it's not one government in Europe that did that, confusing things. They were just different actors. But still, about this West European perspective, and I think this is a very interesting contribution to the discussion about the refugee crisis, when, say, Eastern and Central Europe is now being accused of being in opposition to multiculturalism, of being closed, and etc., etc. But the difference between, say, of course these are very subjective terms, Western Europe and Central Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe, it's not only that Central Eastern Europe was for a very long time under the control of socialist governments in the 20th century, but also the difference is that most of Central Eastern Europe, European countries did not have any colonies overseas, especially in Africa and Asia. So Western Europe, that now claims this primacy of being so super multicultural, that basically was so open to multiculturalism for very early on, the experience that Central Eastern Europe did not have. Of course, Central Eastern Europe, they are also multicultural, but in a very specific way. Those were the products of their empires, and you know, if we look at the Hungarian cuisine or Romanian cuisine, we find all those mixtures of cultures and traditions. It's also multicultural, but not in the way that the West is multicultural, or Western Europe proper is multicultural. Thank you.
No, I think that's an excellent point, or both points are excellent. I mean, when I remember when there was this whole debate on multiculturalism around Salman Rushdie's book, if you remember, after he had the fatwa, and then there was this whole debate on integration, etc. I remember saying at a public discussion, these are the chickens of empire coming home to roost. Basically British multiculturalism, right? So you have a history of migration, first in one direction, which is colonial or imperial expansion, not migration. But then it's also interesting what the terminology is, right? Because now they are complaining about all these Wirtschaftsflüchtlinge, all these economic refugees. But what were the British adventurers who were all over the colonies? They were all also economic adventurers who were all making fortunes in the colonies. And of course, apart from that, you had hundreds and thousands of migrants from Western Europe to North America, who were all not political refugees. They were all economic migrants, right? So obviously, out-migration from Europe has all been about seeking a better life for yourself. And this is exactly what you're not willing to give to the other person. Now, so yes, there has been a very long history of migration and multiculturalism of a certain kind. And you are absolutely right. Germany, the discussion is very different from Britain, because the idea always has been ideologically, we are not a society which has taken in the immigrants, this is not a multicultural society, etc., etc. So the discourse on multiculturalism is linked in very many ways with the colonies and the empires. On your first point, I think I would agree with you half. I agree entirely that this is not a central government which is sending out missionaries. In fact, the colonial government in the colonies was quite suspicious of the missionaries very often, because the missionaries were much closer to the natives and didn't keep enough distance, and they learned all these native languages because they had to translate the Bible into these languages for them. And so there was a lot of tension between the colonial government and the missions. So if I came across as saying these were the same actors, I did not make a differentiated enough argument. My argument was on a different level. I think it's about thinking of processes of secularization. So it's the same society in which there is secularization at home and missionizing abroad. Everyone is going to church on Sunday in raising money for these poor African kids who now have to be turned into Christians, right? And so it's the disjunct between not telling the story of the missionizing abroad as part of the story of exactly the same society which is involved. It's not the same actors, but it's about a process of secularization which only tells a partial story because to that belongs the story of missionizing, only it's happening somewhere else. So I think the self-representation of Europe as secularizing must take also into account the story that it is missionizing at the same time. So it cannot be that secular in its self-understanding, because then you would be spreading the same secularism everywhere, right? So I think something interesting is happening here. A lot of crossovers are happening. Like, for example, Jean and John Komarov have a brilliant essay in which they show that the poor working class areas of London are being described as Africa in London. So it's all the stereotypes and all the prejudices which one has against the Africans are the ones which are being used to understand why the poor are poor, the working class. And they live in darkness, and they live in ignorance, and they need to be missionized. Because they don't go to church, they're not really believing Christians, they need to be educated. So middle-class British women are all involved in these projects to enlighten the Africans in our midst. But the Africans in your midst are your working classes. So it's, there are very, very interesting linkages in the way these imageries work and connect.
Yeah, I think Marta had a question.
Well, I think as one of the few non-Europeans in the room, I think Kate is another one over there, and I don't know how you...
You're from another colony, don't forget.
Oh, no, that's true. But now I always say, as somebody who was seduced very young by these conversations about truth, for me, looking at Europe in the 20th century was always a bloodbath. It was never the pinnacle of civilization, it was a bloodbath, and how do you understand that bloodbath? But I wanted to actually add something to the conversation by the strategist who asked beforehand, going back to Arendt, which I don't know whether this will be a productive line of comparison, but maybe I will throw it out in case it is for other people. So the section in Origins of Totalitarianism that you brought up, where Arendt talks about imperialism, and one of the arguments she makes there is about the distinction between the mob and the masses. And she gives a genealogy of Nazism in which Nazism comes from the mob. And the mob is not the masses of the previously politically indifferent or apathetic. The mob is the kind of dark underside of the bourgeoisie. The mob is the gangsters. And she makes the claim, and I don't know whether this is true or not because I don't study German imperialism, but she makes the claim that it was precisely the colonies that give the mob something to do and allow them to develop a racist ideology, because it's only somewhere else that they can actually feel themselves to be German, because they're too wrapped up in their class alienation when they're actually in Germany. So it was precisely this exporting of the gangsters that gave them a certain ideology of racism, which they then bring back, and then she has this vision that it's then the mob that kind of co-opts the masses, and that's where you get the origins of Nazism. And I'm wondering about this idea of the gangsters, and if that would be or not a productive line of inquiry for what's happening between Russia and Ukraine today. Because it does seem that a lot of the people who are showing up from across the border are kind of gangster types. They're not necessarily elites, or they're not intellectuals, but they seem to be the kind of people that would fall into Arendt's profile of who is the mob.
Right. I think this is an excellent observation, part of the essay, which I can neither comment on as a non-historian of both Ukraine and of Germany, so I don't know. But what I do want to point out is that what someone like Sebastian Conrad's work shows among others, in the last years, is that even the concentration camps as a technology of vernichtung, of destruction, annihilation, are first tried out on a small scale in the German colonies in Africa. So it's really the connections between even the modernity of National Socialism and the colonies is really a very strong one.
Yeah.
Could I follow up on this? Yeah, I'm from the Netherlands, but not really, because I was born in Belgium. My history books were full of these poor, tiny, brave people that Caesar had not been able to conquer, the Romans, were then oppressed by the French, the Austrians, the Dutch, the Spanish, until then finally in 1830 they became independent and started fighting each other. Right? So that Europe as a bloodbath fits very well with my old history books. It's full of fighting. And it's true that also in that context, I'm from a tiny village, you either conformed or you could leave. You could leave to the colonies, to missionarize. This was where the adventure. My village had the highest number of priests and missionaries and nuns of the whole business. So it was good, adventurous people, but they were having only one option. To do that, it was to conform or to leave. I think, so what you said about the mob, it turns the question backwards and ask ourselves, what is it? What kind of societies breeds this type of gangsters that goes out somewhere else to be violent and claim a life for themselves that's only possible by oppressing or killing other people, right? It's a type of society that breeds this type of mobs. What kind of society is that? Europe apparently should be a good example for that. It has bred a lot of that, both towards the colonies and also within all its own empires, right? So maybe that's a way in which this kind of connection also to Ukraine can be made. Like, where does that come from?
And the people you're talking about who left as missionaries, I mean, it's about marginalization.
Yeah,
right? The
yeah.
people who were marginalized, then they need somewhere to go.
Or it's about the total truth that some people just...
Yeah, it's hard for me to maybe you have some comments on what?
No, I just wanted to tell a story. Like Marcy, I like stories. So I'm an anthropologist. So I just wanted to tell a story on Belgium Congo, which I think is of a very different kind of violence, but it's a Foucauldian story, so we will rehabilitate him right in the end, because it's a good story. So what we have is Nancy Rose Hunt's work on the Belgian Congo, where she shows that one of the things that the colonizers are very concerned about are the low fertility rates in the colonies. So if you are thinking today that from the European perspective, Africa and India are all overpopulated, when they were colonies, they were always underpopulated. And they were always underpopulated because what you wanted from the colony was labor power, so you could not have enough. So the birth rates were too low. So you had this famous Governor General in India who wrote to the Queen of England a letter in which he said, "Your Majesty can be rest assured that I'm doing my best to increase the fertility rate in India." How he was doing it, we don't quite know. But in the Belgian Congo, we do know. So here they found that the Congolese women were breastfeeding their children for very long and using that as a method of natural contraception. So, of course, the colonial office, through the factory in which they were supposed to be, in which they were now forced to work, introduced bottle feeding. And said breastfeeding is not allowed anymore. You have to bottle feed your babies, And then they wanted to make sure, and the missionaries were getting very upset about, they were writing lots of letters, and among their letters you find them saying, the major problem here is that the Belgian, the Congolese women are denying themselves to their husbands. Because while they breastfed, the taboo was you would not have any sexual relationship with your husband. So this could be like 2 to 3 years that they were breastfeeding their babies. So in order to increase the fertility rate in Congo, they introduced the bottle in the factory, and they were exhorting these women, whom they had by now converted to Christianity, to go back and resume sexual relationships with their husbands soon after birth. And this is when the colonies are, the Germans are worried that Tanganyika is underpopulated, the British are, worried constantly, India is underpopulated, Togo is overpopulated, the Belgians are complaining about Congo being underpopulated. So all the colonies, by definition, were considered underpopulated. Come 1950s, the colonies are independent, and suddenly the same colony, ex-colonies, are now overpopulated because they can now start sending the migrants into the colonizing countries. So it's so much, it's not a question of demography, it's a question of the optic through which you are looking at what the relationships between countries should be. And I think this question of the history of what is an overpopulated territory or not, and it goes back to Tim's whole story in the Black Earth on Lebensraum, which is so much a question of which territory can you claim for which population, and which population is rightly considered to be in need of which resources, and why it is the right of certain populations to claim certain territories, labor of some and territories of others, in order to be able to fulfill the living standards which they think they are entitled to. And I think this is a very large global story in which we can tell the whole story of the 19th and 20th centuries as a story of entanglements in how we perceive of other populations and territories as part of what your citizens' entitlements are.
I'm just using the opportunity, already holding the microphone, and wanted to ask you really shortly, because in just a couple of minutes we have to leave. To be honest, I have been thinking about this kind of approach and who would be the right person to ask, and finally I found this person. It's really you. Because you see, coming from the field which is very much about post-colonial studies, and it's really interesting to compare it with the Ukrainian situation. And somehow it's not by occasion that the first question about self-awareness as being a colony was asked in that way. Because you see, this approach as a methodology, post-colonialism, has been never actually practiced really in Ukraine. So it became like a fashion a bit in the 90s. So some Ukrainian intellectuals were like picking up some ideas from Sela Ben Habib or some other authors, and like trying to impose this agenda, this kind of perspective on Ukrainian reality, on the post-Soviet one. But at the same time, it was not so profound. And this somehow unwillingness to think about the reasons why this theory is important, and is it suitable to Ukrainian situation or not, somehow resulted in the situation, in the circumstances when this not finished post-colonialism was accompanied by the nationalistic discourse in Ukraine. And now usually, again, turning back to the first question that was asked, that you were asked, first intention, the first reflex, when today people speaking about Ukraine being a colony, is about the Soviet past. So Our colleague mentioned about 70 years, so it's not like so much as a couple of hundreds, it's only 70s. As if before the Soviet Union, Ukraine was totally free, and it was like a powerful state and leader in this European region. So nobody's treating being a colony for Ukraine as a part of the Tsarist Russia, of the Russian Empire, but being inside the Soviet Union, which was, by the way, for Ukraine as a state, the first subjectivation as a state, somehow, I would say. I mean, in the real world, in the real politics. It's a very common accusation. So I would like to ask you, what would you say? What are the boundaries of the post-colonial approach in Ukraine? So is the Soviet Union the case to be called empire and Ukraine like a colony, which is of course totally different from Algeria and France and so on? So what are the measures of this approach, and to which extent it fits to Ukrainian situation? Because I understand that it's a very long talk, but just maybe.
Professor, I'm going to pass on this, not because it's a long and difficult question, but out of sheer ignorance. This is, I think, a very, very interesting subject which one would need to go into, not only because of the academic complexities of the matter, but because I think politically also it's such a sensitive issue, and it has ramifications into so many political debates. So I don't want to give you ignorant answer to this. I think we need to think through this carefully together. I'd be very happy to come back, because actually now I realize that it was not such a bad idea to give the talk. I haven't bored everyone to death, and the talk makes some sense to some of you at least. So I think we need to think about this very carefully. I just want to make one remark, and that is on nationalism. I think this is it's a very, very difficult question, because very often one of the reflexes in this anti-colonial critique is a very strong nationalist reflex. And we know that from the Indian case of the nationalist movement. Fortunately, we had someone like Gandhi with a sense of humor and a sense of irony and an absolute insistence on having a non-violent movement against the British. And he was once asked, Mr. Gandhi, what about the nation state? And he said something very interesting. He said, a nation without a history is a very happy nation. And I'm going to leave you to think about that.
Yeah, thank you very much.